Hi there, I'm Nate Reese, and I'd like to let you know that there is a reasonable defense you can use to defend your faith as a Christian. If you're watching this video and you have questions or doubts, I'd like to let you know that there is a series of proofs we can use to prove a God's existence. Through this series of videos I'm about to introduce you, I'll use several arguments to defend the existence of a God, and then thus we shall move on to historical apologetics, where we will defend the gospel and Christ himself. So thus, I now introduce to you a series that I'd like to call The Proofs for God's Existence. Enjoy.
What would it take to make you believe? More fire from the sky, another part in the sea. The honest truth is that
Welcome to an apologetics session. I'm Nate Reese. Of course, you might be asking what apologetics is. Apologetics is the defense of the Christian faith against other opposing worldviews like atheism, evolutionism, Hinduism. You can name it off the top of your head, and we defend our faith against this kind of stuff. So we'll be starting a series called The Proofs of God's Existence, in which there's several proofs which each use a different starting characteristic or a starting line in order to go up to God. And I'll be starting with the cosmological proof for God's existence. First, before I do that, I'll list off the proofs of God's existence. Just give me a second here, folks. Sorry about that. And first, the cosmological argument comes in two forms: vertical and horizontal. A cosmological argument starts with the universe had a beginning, and the what we call horizontal argument, I think. Yes, the horizontal argument for the cosmological argument for God's existence starts at the point that the universe had a beginning. And then the other form of the cosmological argument, which is the vertical argument, starts with dependence. Like every part of the universe is dependent on each other, and we'll explain that in this video. And the teleological argument focuses on order and design in the universe. The ontological argument isn't really considered an argument for God's existence anymore, but it is an argument for God's characteristic that he has. So we'll explain the ontological argument, even though thus it isn't a proof for God's existence anymore, as most classical apologists don't consider it. The argument from moral law, the morality argument, proposed by several people, including C.S. Lewis himself. We'll explain that too. That argument explains that morality leads to a moral lawgiver. We'll explain that in another video for another time. And we'll also explain the argument from religious need, the religious need of God, that even atheists feel. And there's several lesser known arguments that you've probably never heard before. The argument from joy, which C.S. Lewis proposed. And that's the last one. But we'll be explaining these arguments for God's existence through a series of videos that I'd like to call The Proofs for God's Existence. And then we'll also dismantle any objections that anyone from opposing worldviews, or such as atheism, for example, might have against the proof for God's existence. So, the cosmological argument, it starts with the first premise of the argument itself, says the universe had a beginning. And of course, this is the one that most people will have an objection to, because you've probably heard on the media or so on and so forth that people have proposed the eternal universe theory, which goes against the Big Bang theory accepted in science today, in which a lot of Christians don't like the Big Bang theory. I'm kind of split on that issue, because the scientific and philosophical evidence can be used to support the first premise of this argument: the universe had a beginning. And the second premise of the argument states anything that had a beginning must have been caused by something else. This premise sometimes is mistaken by atheists who say that, oh, well, you're saying that everything has a beginning, so that means God himself must have had a beginning too. And we'll explain against that also. And number 3 is the finishing statement of the basic form of the horizontal cosmological argument, and it says that therefore the universe was caused by something else, a creator, a first cause that we call in philosophy, religious philosophy. So the scientific evidence for this first premise, as Norman Geisler states in this book, the big book of apologetics, which is the Christian Apologetic Encyclopedia, states that the Big Bang, which is mostly controversial among Christians, the decision over whether it's to be accepted by or not is kind of split. For example, this book right here, Creation and Evolution by J. Segert, goes against the Big Bang theory, and it actually offers some realistic stuff against the Big Bang theory, realistic evidence against it that we don't see in the universe. However, since the Big Bang is mostly accepted by scientists along with evolution, we might go against it, we might not. And I'll offer 2 videos on that upcoming, on whether or not we should accept the Big Bang theory, but that's another subject for another time. So the Big Bang theory states that the universe came into being some 15 to 20 billion years ago in a big explosion of matter, where we get our gases from, the elements. And scientists offer 4 proofs for this. The red shift, or the Doppler effect, which is noticed in the light from stars as they move away. That's what Hubble noticed in his telescope. And that's where we get the Big Bang theory from, because that was the first existing proof they used. The radiation echo from space, which has the same wavelength that can be given off by a gigantic cosmic explosion. And the discovery of a mass of energy such as that would be expected from an explosion, in the general theory of relativity proposed by Einstein. And since the Big Bang is kind of controversial among Christians, I won't use it as a total proof for the beginning of the universe, but since it states that there is a beginning of the universe, and since it irritates most scientists, even to this day, who try to propose something else like an eternal universe theory, I'll use it for now, but other than that, I'll go for the second law of thermodynamics later. Now, if the universe exploded 15 to 20 billion years ago, then that means that there was nothing before it, which most scientists, including atheists, agree to this day, that there was nothing before the explosion went off 15 to 20 billion years ago. Now, if there is nothing, then something can't come from nothing, which is a fundamental law in the first principle. Nothing cannot come, well, nothing comes from nothing, but something cannot come from nothing. It's impossible. You can't take something from nothing. And especially a lot of nothing is not going to make a lot of something. It just is common sense. So the Big Bang theory, with the idea of an explosion 15 to 20 billion years ago with nothing before it and then something after, kind of has this supernatural idea to it that there must have been some outside agent in the universe that somehow caused this Big Bang to happen in the universe. But since the Big Bang is kind of controversial among Christians to this day, we'll go for the second law of thermodynamics, which is strong evidence itself for the beginning of the universe. And nobody denies the second law of thermodynamics except the eternal universe theory proponents. According to the second law of thermodynamics, in a closed, isolated system, energy will run down. Usable energy will run down. Now, if usable energy in a closed system will run down in a closed system like the universe with nobody outside of it, if the eternal universe will propose such, then that means that an eternal universe that's so far, well, we can't say that it's lasted for an amount of time because it's impossible to measure eternal time in a usable amount of time like today, which I'll explain later. Then the energy of stars that would have existed always would have run down by now. That means that we would have no stars by now, because the usable amount of energy in the stars would eventually runs down. For example, the sun is proposed to explode eventually and consume the solar system in a couple billions of years ago. I mean, billions of years in the future from now, like 1 billion years, according to scientists. But if the sun is going to go away in a billion years, then I would say that trillions of years isn't going to mean that our sun or any star for that matter is going to last. Either they turn into black holes or neutron stars after that, and then eventually we have nothing. That means no life, it's just a sterile environment. Thus, no life could have happened, with the second law of thermodynamics blocking any proponent of an eternal universe. And of course, we have a bunch of eternal universe theories proposed out there, like, for example, the idea that there's like a bouncing ball, the universe is, where it expands and then it comes back down, and then another big bang happens and explodes, comes out and comes back in again. But once again, the second law of thermodynamics would prevent that from happening. Because, and an example I wish I could do, but I can't right now, if you put a bouncing ball down, like throw it down and it'll come back up, eventually it's going to peter out. Which eventually, that's what this shock wave of explosion after explosion after explosion after explosion would do. It would go a little bit far this way, come back down, explode again, but it would go only a little bit farther because the energy being used would be gone for the explosion. And then it would come back in, less energy would be available to keep on going like that. Boom, boom, and boom. And then eventually the shock wave won't even be able to explode anymore because there wouldn't be enough energy. All the usable energy would peter out according to the second law of thermodynamics. So thus, that theory itself is dismantled. So if we can use that as scientific evidence for a cause at the beginning of the universe, a beginning of the universe. Now, everything that begins must have a cause for its existence. Now, atheists kind of misrepresent this and say that we Christians are saying that everything has a beginning. So then they use that against us and say, well, God can't. That means God must have a beginning. But if God must have a beginning, that means He must have had somebody else create Him, and then somebody else create Him, and then it will have an infinite regress of events that's impossible, scientifically or philosophically. But the problem is that we Christians don't state that everything has a beginning. We state that anything that has a beginning must have been caused by someone else. And we believe that God is eternal. And the reason He is eternal is because He is transcendent above the universe. That means He's not limited to the laws that He makes, although it comes from Him. And if He's transcendent above the laws that limit us in our existence as contingent beings, and He's a necessary being, then that means that He Himself would be transcendent above it, because if He wasn't transcendent above the laws that He makes for this universe, then that means He couldn't have created the universe. Which is another point for another time. Some people will say that God isn't completely transcendent, and that's finite Godism. But we'll explain that in another time in a theism series, maybe. So, The philosophical evidence for time having a beginning itself is a little bit confusing. You're going to have to kind of come through this with me. Statement number one for the philosophical evidence that time had a beginning is an infinite number of moments cannot be traversed. That means it can't be traveled back in or traveled forward in. And statement number two says if an infinite number of moments had to elapse before today, then today would have never come. And that makes sense because today is a stopping mark. It's a measure we use for time. But an eternal universe, that means that an eternal universe would have no need for any time marker on it because it's always is, always was, always is, and always is going to be. So that means we have no need for time measures like months or anything like that because we would know that the universe has always existed. But if the universe has always existed, today wouldn't come. And the way it can be illustrated is, say you're at a library, right? And there's an infinite number of books. If you traverse back, you will never get to the start of that library. Of the library shelf. If you traverse forward, you'll never get to the end. So thus, if there's no end, no start, then no need for a current moment. However, but today has come, and we do measure time. We do measure it with a ruler and markers, and thus. So therefore, if today has come, that means an infinite number of moments has not elapsed before today. That means the universe had a beginning. But whatever has a beginning is caused by something else, hence there must be a cause, creator of the universe, a first cause. And thus the horizontal argument for God's existence argues forward and backward, which is why it's called a horizontal argument. But what it means by that is that there was an efficient cause for the beginning of the universe. However, the one weakness of the horizontal argument is it doesn't argue that God, or the cause for this universe, would have to exist right now and the entire universe is dependent on him, which is what the vertical argument argues for. But before I get to that, I'll finish out on the horizontal argument. So if an infinite number... Sorry, I almost lost myself there, but... Okay, so the universe had a beginning, which we've already discussed the philosophical and the scientific evidence for that point. We know that the universe had a beginning because the second law of thermodynamics in science does not permit the universe to be eternal in any way, shape, or form. And the Big Bang Theory, although controversial among Christians, also itself prevents the idea of an eternal universe. So, the vertical argument, and just finishing out the horizontal argument, thus says that if the universe had a beginning, then that means that God, or a first cause, caused the universe itself to exist. So, the vertical argument argues that there is a cause right now, instead of the horizontal argument arguing that there was a cause then. So, the cause right now argument simply argues every part of the universe is dependent. If every part is dependent, then the whole universe must also be dependent. That's the first and second premises. And the third and final premises says, therefore the whole universe is dependent for existence right now on some independent being. Some independent being that's not part of this universe, which what pantheists will propose that God is part of the universe. But that wouldn't make any sense because the universe had a beginning, and if the universe had a beginning, and if God is part of the universe, then that means that God would have ceased to exist. And that means that nothing could have caused that universe to exist, but something did. So thus there can't be a pantheistic God. Because if a God is a part of this universe, then that means that the God would have perished at the beginning of that universe. It wouldn't have existed, because there would have been nothing before this God that's a part of the universe. All is one and one is all. But back to the point. So the reason there's an independent being instead of a dependent one is because an independent being can't be part of this universe where all the parts are dependent on each other. Otherwise, this independent being would be dependent on the parts of the universe. And if the universe ceased to exist, then that means this independent being would cease to exist too. But if he's independent from the universe, that means he doesn't have to cease to exist just because the universe does. But the universe is completely dependent on its existence right now because of an independent being. Of course, critics respond that the second premise is the fallacy of composition. Just because every piece of a mosaic is square does not mean the whole mosaic is square. What they're saying is just because parts of the universe are dependent on each other doesn't mean the entire universe is dependent on some existing independent being right now. They also state that also putting two triangles together doesn't necessarily make another triangle. It may make a square. The defenders of this argument will answer that sometimes there is a necessary connection between the parts of the whole. For example, if every piece of a wooden floor is oak, then that means the entire wooden floor is oak also. That wouldn't mean that if every part of the wooden floor is oak, then that means it would be birch, which wouldn't make any logical sense. And putting two triangles together, although it wouldn't necessarily make another triangle, it would make a geometric figure, another one, which a triangle and a square both agree on. Which means that even if the universe basically is a little bit different from the dependent parts on each other, if it forms something else other than the dependent parts, it is still has a characteristic possessed by the parts. Some critics argue that the whole is greater than the parts, so while the parts are dependent, the whole universe is not. However, this doesn't work in the case of the universe. If one contingent part in the universe ceases to exist, if one tiny little piece of the universe falls out, like say the distance between our Earth and the Sun, then life wouldn't exist. Or if some part of the universe just ceases to exist, the entire universe collapses on itself and it also ceases to exist. And evidently, the entire universe is dependent. Now, if the entire universe is dependent on on all these parts put together by itself, and if just one part will fall out and, oh no, the entire universe falls out together, then that means something is holding it up. So something independent is holding this entire universe together up, which makes sense. Say this wooden table right now that I have has two parts on it. It has two parts of this table, right? Now there's something underneath this table that holds it up, and that is the floor. However, the floor is not part of the table. Now, if the floor is not part of the table, then it's independent from the table. Meaning that although this floor is holding this table up, then that means that it's independent. But if there was no floor to hold this table up, then that means this table would fall through completely and land down into the basement of this house, which isn't really a good thing if you want to eat. But that's just the illustration to give. Just think of it this way. The universe is an entire piece put together, and its foundation that it's laid on, that's holding it up, is God Himself. God is an independent being that's holding up the entire universe together, and if He wasn't holding it up, then that would mean that the entire universe would collapse on itself. And the Bible affirms this characteristic for God Himself in Colossians. You've probably heard this verse before if you're a Christian. Colossians 1:15 through 17. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through Him and for Him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. So if in Jesus, who we believe is God, if all these things are dependent on him, that means if Jesus didn't exist and wasn't holding up the universe itself, then the universe would fall through. And we've already seen that the universe is dependent on each other. If one part of the universe didn't exist, then life itself wouldn't exist as we know it, and I wouldn't be telling you this right now. So through the vertical cosmological argument, as we see, we argue a characteristic for the first cause, that he is an independent being that is holding up the entire universe, which is something that deists who believe that God created the world and the universe, but he kind of left it out on its own, would oppose, would criticize this argument, because they believe that the universe isn't completely dependent on God. But through the vertical cosmological argument, we see that the entire universe is dependent on God himself. So through the horizontal cosmological argument, to summarize this all up and to end this video, we see that we argue back in time for the first cause himself causing this universe, and we see that there is philosophical and scientific evidence for this, especially through the second law of thermodynamics. And we see in the vertical argument for the cosmological argument, and we see through the vertical cosmological argument that, lost my focus. We see through the vertical cosmological argument that we can argue for a characteristic for this first cause, that the entire universe is dependent on him right now. So basically, the cosmological argument can state thus in its arguments. 1. God created the universe, because the universe had a beginning, and all things that come to exist must have a cause for their existence. And 2. Every part of the universe is dependent. If one piece fell out, then the entire universe would fall apart, meaning some independent being is holding up the entire universe even as we speak. So thus, this is where I conclude the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Until next time we'll be discussing the teleological argument. You might find that one more exciting than the cosmological argument, as we'll see, where we'll be discussing scientific evidence for God's existence as well. Until next time, I'm apologist Nathan Reese, although amateur. I still have the knowledge to produce to you in order to defend my faith. I'll see you next time.